There is hardly anything more boring than listening to someone else's dream, writes George Johnson in his review of Anthony Stevens' book, Private Myths, Dreams and Dreaming. Now, that may be true enough in most instances. Nevertheless, our fare today is the account of one of the more famous of all dreams, in which Jacob, by any measure a scoundrel, understood himself to be called, commissioned, and claimed by God. As long ago and as far away as the story is, however, it invites you and me to consider our own call, that through our fidelity to God, our worship of God, and the gifts we give back to God, others may be claimed by that grace which still chooses what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, what is weak in the world to shame the strong. The first 11 chapters of Genesis tell of primeval history, the creation, fall, and expulsion from the garden, the sad tale of Cain and Abel, the horrors of the flood, and the Tower of Babel, that primal act of idolatry. With the 12th chapter, the nature of the literature changes to what many scholars call legend rather than history, simply because there are no extra biblical confirmations of the husband Joseph. 10 chapters are devoted to the saga of Abraham and Sarah, at times so painfully and embarrassingly human, nevertheless extolled appropriately throughout both Old Testament and New as the father and mother of faith. Now, Sarah lived more than 30 years after the birth of Isaac. She died in Hebron, an ancient town still frequently in the news. Abraham bought a burial site near there where he was also buried some years later. Before Abraham died, he sent a trusted emissary to Haran, from which he and Sarah had come, for the purpose of selecting a wife for Isaac. Thus, Rebekah appears on the scene, a young woman whom Isaac loves very much, though chosen for him sight unseen. It appeared for some years that she would be as barren as Sarah was, thus all the familiar anxieties well up again. However, at last she did conceive, but the pregnancy was painfully difficult. Twins who struggled within her, the narrator tells us. She feared she would die, and on some days would have preferred it. But God said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. When the twins were born, the first came out red, his body like a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau. The second was not far behind, his hand gripping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob, which means he takes by the heel, or he supplants. Thus begins the strange and twisted Jacob saga, proof again that God draws straight with crooked lines, as Andrew Greeley put it once. As literature, it is wonderfully told, but as Walter Brueggemann commented, the narrative is not edifying in any conventional religious or moral sense. It may even be considered offensive. However, for that very reason, it is most lifelike. It presents Jacob in his crude mixture of motives. This grandson of the promise is a rascal compared to his faithful grandfather Abraham or his father Isaac. The narrative shows that the purposes of God are tangled in a web of self-interest and self-seeking. Well, take him or leave him. That's all you can do with Jacob. And the most astonishing claim of the story is that God takes him. Indeed, God takes the whole dysfunctional family. Described this other commentator, Jacob is a cheat, Esau is an idiot, Isaac a doddering old man, Rebekah a manipulator. But here is the point of it, the good news in it. Israel saw herself in this family and recognized that God chose her, bound himself to her, used her for no other reason than his inexplicable grace. Years later, Paul would sum it up this way: let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. That Jacob's would be a troubled life was signaled in Rebekah's pregnancy and in God's explanation of it. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. In those times, if there was one inviolable social expectation, it was the rule of primogeniture, whereby the firstborn son, even if firstborn by only a matter of seconds, would become head of the family and receive double the inheritance. That the elder should serve the younger was a scandalous inversion of law and privilege, in which Israel recognized something crucial about the workings of God, that God is free to accomplish his purposes with no thought given to human convention and the definitions of social propriety, which led Paul to this stunning insight. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. How candid are we willing to be about the person looking back at us from that mirror on the wall? God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. That God chose Jacob is scandalous, a stumbling block, which is what the word means. But then God himself is scandalous, isn't he? He who chose to make every broken thing whole again through one who was crucified between two petty thieves. For Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom. But we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. Esau, the red and hairy one, became an outdoorsman and a skillful hunter, the favorite of his father Isaac. Jacob was a quiet man living in tents, the text tells us. He was the favorite of his mother Rebekah. He was also something of a chef, apparently, is what you learned in Sunday school coming back to you. One fateful day, Esau came blustering in from some manly foray into the wilderness. He was famished and demanded a heaping bowl of the lentil stew Jacob was brewing. The wily Jacob obliged, but not without extracting a price. Esau's birthright, the right of the eldest son to head the family and receive a double share of the inheritance. The witless Esau readily agreed. I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me? Why did God choose Jacob, you ask? Well, let's face it, the alternative had little to commend him either. As Isaac neared death, he commissioned Esau to prepare for him a sort of last supper of fresh wild game, after which there would be conferred the all-important blessing authenticating the birthright. Rebekah overheard this and was determined to circumvent it. The minute Esau disappeared into the bush, she instructed Jacob to fetch some game himself, and she prepared a scrumptious meal which she knew Isaac would like. When Jacob presented it to his father, his smooth skin covered now with the hairy hide of a goat. Hang on a minute. Yeah, the voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. When Esau returned, he cried bitterly, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and look, he has taken away my blessing." Esau threatened to kill Jacob. Is it any wonder? But the constantly eavesdropping Rebekah overheard that too. She quickly packed Jacob a lunch and a change of clothes and sent him off to Haran for a long visit with her brother Laban. And thus we come to the remarkable event described in the chapter assigned for today. Jacob made a camp for the night deep in the heart of nowhere at all, alone with his guilt and apprehensive that an outraged Esau might not be far behind. With a stone for a pillow, he fell asleep and had a dream, which through the ages, the listening community of faith has found anything but boring. Unlike Freudian dreams, biblical dreams reflect not the resolution of stress or anxiety or subconscious fears. They are rather forms of divine communication in which purposeful encounters with God take place. Observe that this encounter occurs not while Jacob is in wakeful control, but in a time of vulnerable yielding while he is asleep. It is entirely at the behest of God, who through it all takes the initiative at a time when Jacob lost control of his destiny. What he saw, in fact, was not a ladder, but rather a ramp. The song, with its interminable verses, junior high schoolers still sing, sitting around the nightly campfire at summer church camp. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder, soldiers of the cross. You remember it? How could you ever forget it? The words are hardly difficult or imaginative, or for that matter, accurate. Not only was it a ramp instead of a ladder, but Jacob, let alone you and I, was not climbing anything. Rather, what he saw were angels, messengers of God, ascending and descending. Now, here is the point in all of that. There is traffic, constant traffic between heaven and earth. As out of whack as it may seem to us on any given day, God is firmly in control of history. God's messengers continually go back and forth from that throne of grace, fulfilling divine commands supervising the earth. This is Brueggemann's insight. Earth is not left to its own resources, and heaven is not a remote, self-contained realm for the gods. Heaven has to do with earth, and earth may finally count on the resources of heaven. If that were not enough for one dream, Jacob next realized that there in the middle of nowhere at all, God was standing right beside him, repeating to him of all people the very same promise which had been made to Abraham and Isaac. The land on which he slept would one day be his. His offspring would be as numerous as the dust of the earth, and through him and his progeny, all the families of the earth would be blessed. Imagine it. He who had stolen the blessing would be a blessing. What an astonishing thing, really. Only the grace of God could have made that up, nor was that the end of it, mind you. God said to this fugitive trickster, "Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I promised you." Can you imagine such a thing? If God chose Jacob, he's apt to choose anybody. That is what Israel read out of this baffling good news. And Paul said, consider your own call, sisters and brothers. But more than that, consider Jacob's response to God's inexplicable grace. We're near the nub of it now. Surely the Lord is in this place and did not know it. Did you hear that word used not as adolescents and Comcast have trivialized it, but as pious shuddering, awe, reverence, wonder, diminished commodities in our age of cynical self-sufficiency, so quick to explain the mysteries away? Abraham Joshua Heschel said that the loss of a sense of wonder is one of the most disastrous things to have happened to us. Dag Hammarskjöld, whose abbreviated life left such an aching hole in the poetry of our souls, committed this to his diary: God does not die on the day when we cease to believe in a personal deity, but we die on the day when our lives cease to be illuminated by the steady radiance renewed daily of a wonder, the source of which is beyond all reason. Awe, reverence, wonder. That is where our response to the initiative of God begins, but that isn't where it ends. After he caught his breath, Jacob made a vow consisting of 3 important commitments. If God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, then first, the Lord shall be my God. God's singular faithfulness to us demands nothing less than our singular, uncompromising faithfulness to him, not to some God of our own devising, a God we prefer to the God who is, some Slumgullian mixture of Mohammed and Buddha and Henry David Thoreau, but rather the God of Exodus and of Easter. If God will be with me, then the Lord shall be my God. And second, this stone, which I have set up for a pillar, shall be God's house. Jacob took the stone he had used for a pillow, upended it, poured oil on it, and called the place Bethel, the house of God. The anointing was an act of consecration, of sanctification, setting that stone and that place apart from all others as a place of worship and adoration. God's commitment to Jacob called forth an echoing commitment of faithfulness and one thing more. If God will be with me and clothing to wear, then of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you. The tithe is a recognition of God's abundant providence, bread to eat, clothing to wear, and safety on the journey. Acknowledgement that God is the sovereign Lord of all the earth. Samuel Shoemaker, the well-known Pittsburgh preacher some years ago, wrote this: if we are to approach this matter in the right way, we shall remember that the giving of the tithe by all who practice it regularly is not a way to raise money or liquidate a debt or promote some cause or interest. It is the carrying out of a sacred obligation and duty to God. It is a priority. All other giving comes after this. What we give as a percentage of what we have is a stern and unforgiving reality check against all our pious claims that the Lord is our God. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters, Paul urged the Corinthians. The New English Bible renders his admonition this way: think what sort of people you are, whom God has called. The sons and daughters of Jacob, every one of us, for whom God nevertheless has a place and purpose, if we are willing in wonder to respond to that inexplicable transforming grace through our fidelity to God, our worship of God, and the gifts we give back to God, to the end that others may be claimed by that same grace, which still chooses what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, what is weak in the world to shame the strong. Here is the gospel. Jesus calls us. By thy mercies, Savior, may we hear thy call. Give our hearts to thine obedience. Serve and love thee, best of all. And there you have it. Expository reflections on Jacob's dream. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Paul urged the Corinthians. The New English Bible renders his admonition this way: think what sort of people you are, whom God has called, the sons and daughters of Jacob, every one of us, for whom God nevertheless has a place and a purpose, if we are willing in wonder to respond to that inexplicable, transforming grace through our fidelity to God, our worship of God, and the gifts we give back to God, to the end that others may be claimed by that same grace, which still chooses what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, what is weak in the world to shame the strong. And then here is the gospel. Jesus calls us. By thy mercies, Savior, may we hear thy call. Give our hearts to thine obedience. Serve and love thee best of all. You remember that, of course, as a verse from Jesus Calls Us O'er the Tumult, the hymn of St. Andrew. So then I said that if we want to stop and talk about that some, let's do that. Otherwise, Jacob's life breaks out pretty much into three parts. The first we've just talked about, the early life and the trip to Haran, including the dream. Then the period in Haran with Laban. And third, the trip home and the wrestling match. And then arguably there's a fourth, but that's simply his life lived out in Canaan before he is finally brought to Egypt with the family. And the only thing of any consequence he did during that period was unfortunately make Joseph a very colorful coat, which began the whole Joseph saga, with which we will conclude next week. So, a pause. Any comments, concerns, questions, observations?
Jack, could you,
Yeah,
it's Marg, could you talk
yeah.
to us or me about angels in our day and age?
I am of a persuasion that angels as God's messengers are still active today, without any doubt. They do not appear to us as winged creatures who glow in the dark, but as very ordinary people. One of the professors at Princeton when I was there was a German professor who was fleeing Germany before Hitler clamped down, and he arrived at a port somewhere in South America, didn't know where he was, and nobody knew he was there, nobody meet him, and somebody walked up to him and said, "Otto Pieper, come with me." And Pieper talked about that for the rest of his life, saying, what else could that be but an angel? Now, again, the word means messenger. And there's no doubt in my mind, but God messenges us and others regularly. Marg, go on, say some more.
Well, I guess I certainly agree with that. Like I think of certain people in my life who have been, I guess, messengers and almost helpers, and people who have sort of put me on the straight and narrow again with my faith. But then you often hear people say, well, there must be an angel watching over you. And what does one say to that? Or if someone you know and loved has died and is in heaven, are they watching over us as angels? I often hear that too, and I don't quite know how to respond to that in my own mind.
Well, if somebody is advancing that point of view, and particularly in a moment of crisis, you just nod your head, I guess. But the business of someone you love who has died and gone to heaven watching over you, that troubles me a little bit in the sense that if those in heaven, whatever and wherever that is, are still worrying about what's going on earth, it's not much of a heaven. So I'm not quite as disposed to that, but I am confident that in terms of the way we live our daily lives, opportunities that are open to us, choices that we have are presented to us by what one might very well call an angel. They look like anybody else that just got off the bus. But yes, I think there are angels that are busily at work.
Thank you.
Yeah. I've got a sermon that I preached years ago that I wish I could recall, that I poked some fun at some of the angel claims. Billy Graham claimed that angels flew airplanes in the Second World War and other kind of stuff that's really pretty wild and far out. Now, I'm certainly in no position to say that didn't happen, but I am in a position to say I have trouble with that. But I would be loath to discount the presence among us of God's messengers. Anybody else? Something else?
About angels?
Pardon?
About angels?
Or anything else? Yeah. What do you think? Is that Patty?
Well, yeah, it's me. Didn't John Calvin say that the scriptures speak to us about angels, but not enough for us to say anything in particular? I mean, there are angels, but we just don't know enough.
But we don't what?
We don't know enough,
Right.
according to Calvin.
And it's interesting to me that in the New Testament anyway, the appearance of angels just scares people silly.
It would scare me.
Well, it depends on the form in which they appear, but every time you see angels, particularly in connection with the birth narrative, it's be not afraid, be not afraid.
Right.
So, anytime the beyond breaks into the present, it's got to be a disturbing experience, I would think.
Real.
But, less than some dramatic thing, I think angels are mixed into the very flotsam and jetsam of our life. I really do.
Is there anything about the cornerstone that may allude to a stumbling block?
About the cornerstone?
That may allude to the stumbling block of Jacob's name. Is that right?
Yeah. There is.
I'm not following. Can you?
The cornerstone is a stumbling block.
That he lay on a mountaintop, or I think. Oh gosh.
No, you're on the right track.
Okay.
So how does the cornerstone become a stumbling block?
Well, you mean the pillow that he anointed for Bethel, house of God?
Yes, thank you, yes.
Or, well, simply the idea that God would call him and enable him to do that very thing, despite who he is and what all he's done, would be to some, anyway, a stumbling block. But to turn that place in the middle of nowhere into something he called Bethel is makes the logical mind stumble, I guess, would be the way I would put it.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Dag Hammarskjöld, whom I quoted earlier, was for a number of years, some of you will remember him, the Secretary General of the United Nations. But more than that, he was an extraordinary poet and mystic. His diary, which was published after his death in an airplane crash, contains this insightful entry. He said, "Forgiveness is the answer to the child's dream of a miracle by which what is broken is made whole again, what is soiled is made clean. The dream explains why we need to be forgiven and why we must forgive. In the presence of God, nothing stands between God and us. We are forgiven, but we cannot feel God's presence if anything is allowed to stand between ourselves and others." Now, before we're through tonight, this is what I want to show you. In the forgiving countenance of one whom you have offended, you see nothing less than the face of God. But you will never see that face clearly until you have confessed that your name is Jacob. Now, I can think of no more fascinating and colorful story in the Bible than Jacob's. His turbulent life was foreshadowed in his mother Rebekah's turbulent pregnancy. The firstborn was named Esau, and the second, not far behind, hanging on tightly to his brother's heel, was appropriately named Jacob, one who supplants. We concluded that if God could use Jacob to further the purposes of his providence, he can use anybody, even the likes of you and me, spiritual warts and all. But that is hardly the end of the story. In his uncle Laban, Jacob met his match as a trickster. When he arrived in the land of Haran, he came upon a well and a beautiful young woman named Rachel, Laban's daughter, who raced home to tell her father the news. Jacob moved in with the family, fell madly in love with Rachel, and agreed to work for Laban 7 years for Rachel's hand in marriage. Now, you know the story, but it's too good not to tell again. The 7 years passed quickly, the narrator tells us, because of the love Jacob had for Rachel. The wedding was a grand affair, but only after the I-do's were done and the veil removed was the bride revealed to be not the young and beautiful Rachel, but her older and much less attractive sister Leah. Laban explained to the outraged Jacob that it was inappropriate for the younger daughter to marry first, but if he would sign on for 7 more years, he could still marry Rachel. And the silly fellow agreed. Now, we talk a lot about dysfunctional families, but Jacob's is a paradigm against which all others must be judged. Leah was clearly unloved, because of which it is alleged in the Bible's quaint language, God opened her womb and closed Rachel's. In rapid succession, Leah produced 4 sons, opining after each one that this would surely make Jacob love her, but it didn't. Rachel's frustration boiled over one day, and she blamed her barrenness on Jacob, a charge which the evidence hardly supported. Jacob pointed that out and said it must be God's fault. Why not? So Rachel took a page out of Sarah's book and offered Jacob her maid, who promptly produced 2 sons, whom Rachel claimed as her own. Now, if you're counting, the total is 6. And it is important that you stay alert to these shenanigans, because the purpose in this convoluted tale is to account for what would become the 12 tribes of Israel. Meanwhile, Leah had become barren. So she offered the exhausted Jacob her maid, who bore him 2 more sons, when lo and behold, Leah conceived again and again, for a total of 10. Then God remembered Rachel, the narrator tells us, who conceived the 11th son and named him Joseph. May the Lord add to me another son, she prayed. That indeed happened some years later, the 12th son named Benjamin. But Rachel died in childbirth. What is purported to be her tomb can be visited today in the countryside near Bethlehem. The yearning to return home was growing in Jacob. As his wages for all these years, he proposed that Laban give him the speckled, spotted, and black sheep from his vast flock. Laban agreed, but then surreptitiously removed and hid all the sheep with those markings before Jacob could cull them. Not to be out-tricked, while Laban was out of town, Jacob devised some means by which the remaining sheep became speckled, spotted, and black. He then gathered up his considerable retinue and headed for home. Laban soon caught up with him. He accused Jacob of deception. Jacob said it takes one to know one. So they shook hands on the deal and piously said to one another, "The Lord watch between you and me when we are absent one from another." Although Esau's name was not uttered throughout any of this, a day did not pass, I suspect, in which Jacob did not think about the inevitable, the moment that would surely come when he would have to face up to what he did to his brother. As he neared the Jabbok River, beyond which he would be in Esau's territory, he sent word that he was approaching. The message came back that Esau and a small army of 400 men were en route to the rendezvous. To put it mildly, Jacob was terrified, his worst fears confirmed. But living up to his name, he quickly set in motion his well-conceived plan. He had no reason to believe that Esau was any less outraged than he had been years before. So Jacob divided his company into 2 parts and sent them off in opposite directions, thinking that if one were destroyed, the other might survive. And then he prayed, "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. Deliver me, please, from the hand of my brother, for I am afraid of him. He may come and kill us all, the mothers with the children. Yet you have said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted because of their number. Now that's quite a prayer, as if from the pious heart of a saint who might have some rightful claim on the mercies of God, rather than from one who had elevated conniving to an art form. Without a doubt, his plaintive honesty was the result not of spiritual insight, but rather of the rapid approach of Esau and his army. Yet it is important to observe that despite his sullied life, Jacob still had a relationship with God, that despite his unfaithfulness, he nevertheless laid claim to God's faithfulness, and above all else, that God heard his prayer. But Jacob is still Jacob. The original praised the Lord and passed the ammunition fellow. He selected several hundred of the choicest animals from his flocks and sent them in staggered bunches in the direction of Esau's advance, hoping thereby to appease him one gift at a time. Then Jacob settled down all alone for the longest and strangest night of his life, a wrestling match with God. Did it actually happen, or was it nothing more than a nightmare? Well, precisely what happened, no one but Jacob can say, but it was something considerably more than a tussle with his guilty conscience. The identity of the man who fell upon him and wrestled with him until daybreak is deliberately obscure. The narrative does not want us to know too much. It's part of the power of the wrestling that we do not know the name or see the face of the antagonist. But Jacob had no doubt that it was God incarnate. The point of that was put no better than by Clarence Wilmot, the Presbyterian minister in John Updike's novel, In the Beauty of the Lilies. In one of Wilmot's sermons, this is some of what he said: "We do not worship a God immensely above us, out of human reach, but one who does not disdain to touch us, to lay even rough hands upon us." And in that brief lifetime recounted in the New Testament, to descend to our condition and to speak to us in metaphors drawn from our daily lives. Martin Luther was bolder yet. Now listen to this. Jacob's antagonist was the pre-incarnate Christ, he claimed. But now, how could Jacob, a mere mortal, stay in the ring with God and hold his own for a second, let alone the whole night long? The ages want to know. Well, the strength of Jacob's determination is no ordinary strength. More than that, however, the story tells of God's incarnate vulnerability, which fully assumed human weakness, born helplessly in a manger, nailed hopelessly to a cross. Brueggemann said the hidden one has the power to injure Jacob, even though he does not finally defeat him. Neither can quite have his way with the other. "Let me go, for the day is breaking," the antagonist demanded. It was an axiom in the Old Testament that God's face could not be clearly seen, for to look upon such holiness would mean death. But Jacob, knowing full well now in whose grip he lay, was desperate enough to take that chance. I will not let you go unless you bless me. Only through God's blessing could the stolen blessing become legitimate and the promises made at Bethel be confirmed. But there was a solemn price to be paid for the blessing he so desperately craved. What is your name? God asked him. Jacob, came the reply. But more than a reply, the name was an admission, a confession. I am Jacob, who takes by the heel, who supplants, who tricks, deceives, and connives his way through life. More than merely his name, Jacob is his nature. God said, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. The blessing Jacob received was a new identity by which he was not immediately transformed, however. He just doesn't know yet when to leave well enough alone. Please tell me your name, he said. To know the name is to know the nature and to have a certain power over another, a confession God was not yet willing to make. In his wily way, Frederick Buechner observed that in the book of Exodus, God tells Moses his name is Yahweh, and God hasn't had a peaceful moment since. Jacob did not learn the name, but he did receive the blessing. As the sun rose, he prepared to cross the river, bearing his new name and his new limp. The narrator has detected a mysterious correspondence in Jacob's nocturnal encounter with God and his meeting with Esau soon to follow. The one mirrors the other. Is it too much to suggest that in some sense, God functions as a substitute for Esau, that the alienations which separate us from each other can never be healed until we are at peace with God? Esau is the noble one in all that follows. There came the groveling Jacob, stiffly and formally bowing himself to the ground 7 times. But Esau, full of joy and forgiveness, ran toward Jacob, picked him up out of the dust, embraced him, and kissed him, and wept. He flatly refused Jacob's gifts, but Jacob insisted, no, please, if I find favor with you, then accept my present from your hand. A present intended as a stratagem for appeasement, an effort to buy that which can never be purchased, but transformed now into an offering, the sacrifice of thanksgiving for the gift of reconciliation. For truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God. The emphasis in most of our talk about forgiveness is on our obligation to forgive. But the emphasis here is on that grace of God which enables us to receive forgiveness. The one is as difficult as the other, because the pride which keeps us from forgiving is the same pride which keeps us from accepting forgiveness. The empowering promise is this, however: in the forgiving countenance of one whom you have offended, you see nothing less than the face of God. but you will never see that face clearly until you have confessed that your name is Jacob.